Should you rip your watercolor paper or cut it? I'm Jess Rice. I'm an art teacher, and beginners are my specialty. First thing I want to check is if it's right side up. On artist grade paper, I have to look for the watermark. I hold it up to the light. I can see that the brand name is reading right in the corners. Manufacturers generally put their watermark in two different corners, so when I rip the watercolor paper, I can tell what side is the right side. You want to work, to start with, on the nice side of the watercolor paper, the right side. Watercolor paper comes in 22 by 30 inches generally. This is a standard size, but I'm going to rip it down to smaller sizes to fit smaller paintings. They make paper this size. When I rip it in half or quarter sheets, it fits standard size frames. So it's much easier to frame watercolors if you use a half sheet or a quarter sheet or even an eighth sheet of this size of watercolor paper. I like using a full sheet of watercolor paper. It's a little bit easier to store. Plus, when I rip it, I have this nice deckled edge on it. It's almost a sin to cut watercolor paper with a scissors. It's better off to rip it. You'll have that nice deckled edge. And why you want that deckled edge is when you frame it later on, you can choose to mat it, cover that edge, or you can float the watercolor so it shows that nice rough edge in your frame when you go to hang it. When you put a light on it, you get a nice shadow underneath of that, and that's what really adds to the effect of watercolors. When you buy smaller sheets, they generally don't have this nice deckled edge on them. They've either been cut down to size generally. They don't have somebody ripping them for you. They're generally cut. So that's why I like to buy a larger sheet and then rip them myself so I have that nice deckled edge on them. When you rip watercolor paper, you want to be a little bit careful with it. There's a specific way to rip it. First off, you want to start with very clean fingers. You don't want to get any grease spots on your watercolor paper. You don't want to float a big wash out there, a big beautiful sky, and realize you've got a big thumbprint right in the middle of it. I'm going to rip this in half. I fold it over, line it up nice. Backside, I can touch that because I'm not planning to paint on that quite yet. I want to crease it. Gently open it back up. And I want to remember what side is up. This is my top side. Again, I crease this side. Nice crease on it. Open it back up, and I just kind of move it back and forth a few times to break that seam. All right, to rip it, I'm using a nice straight edge. So I get a nice rip along here. This is just a metal ruler that I use. It's got a nice straight edge on it. It's nice and stiff. Line it up on my fold. When I begin ripping the watercolor paper, I want to hold my finger tight at the very top and about 6 inches down. Hold my paper nice and tight, grab this corner and start pulling it towards me. Start ripping the paper. Here's the critical part. Move your fingers down to where you just ripped, hold tight again, and continue ripping. Move your fingers down, hold tight, and continue ripping. If you don't hold tight, as you rip, you may get a big piece that rips into your watercolor paper. It happens all the time. So you want to be a little bit careful, holding tight on your straight edge, rip down a little bit more, move your fingers down, and rip the rest of the way. Now that I've ripped these, I can see the watermark on one side, so I know that this is the front of this watercolor paper. This side doesn't have the watermark on it. So I just want to take a pencil and just put a little X on the back side of my watercolor paper. You can paint on both sides of this watercolor paper, but the top side is the preferred side that you want to start with. Some watercolor papers, the watermark is in both corners. Some of them just put it on one edge. So when you rip it, just check to make sure that you keep your paper right side up, and it's best practice just to mark the back. And then I never have to think about what's the front and what's the back. I pull it out, I see I have an X on it, I'm on the back side.